it's down, the steel is in position and the powder is protected. When the flint strikes, it knocks the cover open. A spring keeps it from flopping around.
The power to snap the flint against the steel comes from a large leaf spring forged out of imported spring steel. Besides this main spring, Mr. Gussler must also make two similar but smaller springs that hold parts in position.
Springs are a real aggravating part of the gun to make. Forging spring steel has to be done much more carefully than wrought iron. If the steel is overheated, it's ruined. Likewise, if you hammer it too cold, it damages the fibers. The springs are V-shaped, so the inner surfaces are filed and polished before they're bent. Afterward, you can't work on the inner faces. Deep file marks or forging flaws may cause the spring to break, so it's polished. It takes 3 or 4 heats to bend the spring into a V shape. The spring is held in place by a screw at one end and a pin at the back that goes through the lock plate. Decorative bevels are filed on the spring. They have no function at all. A good spring should bend evenly from front to back. After tempering, its action should be smooth and crisp and not feel mushy. Springs are tempered in lead heated to the boiling point. By submerging the springs in the molten lead, you get an even heat throughout the thick and thin parts. After heating, they are quenched in linseed oil. After quenching, the springs are very brittle. They are then polished, put on a bar in the forge, and heated. This softens them somewhat and gives the springs flexibility. As the heat increases, colors appear. The colors are first yellow, then violet, then blue. Pale blue is used in tempering springs. These colors are used in tempering tools also. Engraving chisels, which have to be harder than springs, are quenched when they are yellow. After tempering, the springs are worked gently to break them in. They are not compressed completely all at once. If a spring is too strong, it can be filed down to weaken it. It files with reluctance, but you can file it down.
When the cock is pulled back, the main spring will be compressed. To hold it there, the gunsmith will cut notches in the tumbler for the sear to catch. The full cock notch is cut square so that the sear can be tripped easily. The half cock notch is undercut so the sear cannot be disengaged. This position is used as a safety. The gunsmith's individuality was often expressed in the engraving. His design was usually scribed directly on the metal and then cut with an engraving chisel kept lubricated by linseed oil.
The basic building blocks of an engraved design are C scrolls, S scrolls, flowers, leaves, and shell designs. The combination of these different details can create endless variations. Or if you took the same design, you might be able to engrave it 500 different ways. You have these various options. You can make some parts move toward you and some move away. If all the pattern is cut the same, it's flat. If you vary the depth of the cuts, it has much more feel. You get a three-dimensional effect.
Finally, the lock is ready for case hardening, which will improve the strength and wear resistance of the lock. A crucible is filled with a mixture of powdered charcoal, ground charred bone, and charred leather. The lock is disassembled and the pieces buried in the crucible. Sealed from the air and surrounded by this mixture, they'll be heated red hot in the forge. The surface of the iron will absorb carbon and thus be converted to steel, while the body itself retains the resiliency of wrought iron. After 5 or 6 hours of heating, the surface steel is hardened by quenching in water. The finished lock is put together and tested for spark. Apart from the barrel and lock, a gun stock requires other metal attachments called mountings. American rifles of the 18th century commonly had brass mountings. Some of these were cast in sand molds.
The first sand is called facing sand, which is a very fine sand mixed with powdered charcoal. This is only used over the patterns. The fill sand is much coarser. Both sands are bound with water. This forms